The United Nations investigator says the U.S. drone strike that killed Iranian commander Qassem Soleimani is unlawful. Her report cited the lack of evidence the commander posed an imminent threat and also singled out Iran's retaliatory strikes against U.S. military bases in Iraq. The UN Human Rights Council, from which the U.S. withdrew in 2018, will discuss the report this Thursday. New measures will then be decided to regulate the use of extrajudicial attacks and drones in warfare. So what exactly constitutes an immediate threat, and why was the U.S. action unlawful? Will the new UN measures proscribe drones altogether? And when the U.S. is not a member of the UN Human Rights Council, what effect will the report and the rulings have? Joining me from Iran is Professor Mousavi, who teaches political science at the University of Tehran, and from the U.S., Dr. Ivan Eland, Senior Fellow at the Independent Institute. Gentlemen, welcome to The Point. So, very quickly, I think it is very clear the situation now. The United States ordered the killing and carried out the killing of General Qassem Soleimani in January near Baghdad's international airport. The U.S. accused him of masterminding attacks against U.S. forces in the region. Now, days later, Iran retaliated against the Iraqi air bases housing U.S. military forces, causing U.S. military forces in Iraq, causing injuries. And then on June the 30th, Iran issued arrest warrants for 36 people, including President Trump, for the killing of General Soleimani. U.S. reaction has been that Ms. Kalama, who is the UN Special Rapporteur, that her report is spurious and that it gives more cause to distrust UN human rights mechanisms. That was by U.S. Secretary of State Mike Pompeo. And on the Iranian side, Iran says it will not stop its efforts until these people are brought to justice by Iran's Deputy Foreign Minister Mohsen Mohammad. So I want to go to Professor Mousavi and Dr. Eland later. Such attacks would be valid if drone in self-defense is used against a clear immediate threat, but the UN has said both the U.S. and Iran's attacks were arbitrary. Mr. Mousavi, what do you think of the ruling? Has it been fair?
Well, I mean, with regards to the United States, they assassinated Qassem Soleimani, Iran's most powerful general, while he was on an official visit to meet the Iraqi prime minister. And Donald Trump initially said that Iran was planning on attacking 4 U.S. embassies, and this was an imminent attack. However, just a few days later, Mark Esper, the Secretary of Defense, actually said on U.S. television that he had seen no such evidence of an attack on 4 U.S. embassies. And here I'm not actually quoting Iranian officials, so even American officials were admitting that there was no such attack planned by the Iranians. And a few weeks after that, we learned from U.S. media that if in fact the Americans had been planning the assassination of Qassem Soleimani a few months in advance. When it comes to Iran's strike, however, on Ain al-Assad, Iran was retaliating to the American move. So Iran's attack was actually a response to the American aggression.
Okay, Dr. Eland, your assessment of the ruling of this report, and if you want, in reaction to Mr. Mousavi's opinions.
Well, I think that's the first part of that is correct. I think the U.S. did violate international law by hitting Soleimani. However, the Iranian response was also against international law. International law is very strict about what happens, self-defense, and that is if there's an imminent attack. And so the U.S. also said they were responding to Iran and trying to deter Iran, but that's not kosher under international law either. And neither was the Iranian response by responding to the U.S. Assassination of Soleimani. So, and the reason that this is so strict in international law is because, countries can make up all sorts of stuff or we're responding to this or that. And, you can even say after the 9/11 attacks at the U.S. invasion of Afghanistan, it may have been justified, but it was technically against international law because it wasn't there were no other imminent attacks planned. It was just retaliation for the 9/11 attacks. So retaliation is not whether you're saying it justifiably or not. Even justifiable retaliation is not is a violation of international law.
I think.
So I think the bottom line is I think this UN person was right on target with her report.
Okay, I get your point. Well, there are different opinions on Iran, on the nature of Iran's behavior, but I think there is a consensus, at least among our two guests, on whether or not the US's act has been legal. The UN Special Rapporteur Anis Kalamat, she cited the UN Charter on targeted strikes, and she tweeted on 11th of July that international law is international, is not American. Dr. Eland, unfortunately, help us understand why she has to highlight that. Does that mean that the United States, especially under this administration, has really looked past international law and kind of just followed the jungle rules, does whatever is convenient in its own interest in disregard of international law?
Well, I think a lot of great powers do this if you have the power to do it. International law is sort of not very effective in many places. I think really what the real problem with this was, certainly Soleimani has supported various groups that the U.S. doesn't like, but the problem was he was effectively the number 2 person of a nation state. Prior to this, the U.S. and Israel and other countries have launched targeted killings against people and small groups like Osama bin Laden, etc. But this was assassinating effectively the number 2 person in a government, and that can lead to very pernicious consequences. World War I was caused by the Serbian government involvement in the assassination of the Austro-Hungarian Empire's number 2 guy, the very similar here, and of course it spun into World War I. Mm-hmm. So we have to be very careful about assassinating other leaders. And in the U.S., there's an executive order against assassinations, but that's only for the CIA. So what leaders do here, the presidents do, is they use the military and say, well, this is a command hit on the command of a nasty country or whatever. And there's also constitutional problems with that in the United States. A strict interpretation of the Constitution, which we should take, says that the president doesn't have the right to do these types of missions. They have to get approval of the Congress and that sort of thing.
Mr. Mousavi, in her interview, Ms. Kalamat said the killing of General Soleimani shows how dangerously close the world has been to a major and deadly crisis. It should send us all a clear warning. The international community now confronts the very real prospect that states may opt to strategically eliminate high-ranking military officials outside the context of a known war and try to justify it on the ground that the target can be classified as a terrorist who pose potential undefined future threat. Your reaction?
I mean, if we think of the situation as reversed, say Iran had assassinated the top American general in a third country, we would have had a full-blown war in our hands. So the Americans do not actually see the way the world that other countries see. And this is the problem we have in international relations, the double standard, where countries such as the United States can essentially get away with anything. And this is not only the Trump administration. Let's remember that under the presidency of George W. Bush, the United States attacked Iraq, which led to around 1 million civilian deaths in a country of 30 million. And that wasn't sanctioned by the United Nations Security Council. And essentially nothing happened to those decision makers, so they got away with it. And other countries are not essentially held by the same standard. The United States can do whatever it wants and get away with it. Even if the UN condemns it or if Iran condemns it, it won't really change the behavior of American decision makers. But in the case of other countries such as Iran, you do have very strict international laws that are enforced.
Okay.
So I think we have to see the root cause of the problem, the Americans not adhering to international law.
However, Professor Mousavi, I have to ask you to respond to the question that even if the killing of General Soleimani is unlawful, how does Iran explain that it stepped out of its way as well, according to the UN report, to carry out this attack under the reason of retaliation, because it has also been ruled unlawful?
Right. Well, I mean, I don't think anyone could expect the Iranians to do nothing after the second highest ranking member of the country was assassinated. I would actually say that the attack on Ain al-Assad was very measured and in fact very tame. It didn't lead to any American casualties whatsoever. It just destroyed a few buildings. And I think Iran's response to the killing of Qassem Soleimani was actually legitimate. Perhaps, like I said, even perhaps very tame.
All right. I do not know whether this would be considered a qualified answer. But anyway, Dr. Eland, I have to ask you, the U.S. has been exiting from different multinational organizations. What about international law? Is the United States going to continue to adhere as much as it can? 30 seconds, please.
Well, I think some of the treaties that Trump has pulled out of and that sort of thing are more important than others, like arms control. And I would argue that one of his biggest mistakes has been pulling out of the Iran nuclear deal. So which is what caused all this problem with Soleimani and that sort of thing. And it's the root cause. And so I think the U.S. Does act unilaterally sometimes, and it does undermine international law. Other countries do that too, especially great powers. The more power you have in the world, the more likely you are to do that. And the United States has been the most powerful country in the world since 1945, and so it tends to not follow the rules sometimes. But other countries do it as well, and that doesn't excuse the U.S. behavior. But I think international law does have uses, but it's limited. It's very limited.
I think a lot of countries would disagree with that. But I get your point. Many thanks. We have to leave it there. Professor Hamed Mousavi and Dr. Ivan Eland. With that, we come to the end of this edition of The Point with me, Liu Xin. Thanks for watching. You've got the point.